Hello, everyone. This is Jeffrey Kerr. I'm here today with a very special guest. He's an actor, playwright, director, theater critic, and historian. I previously had him on 5 years ago during the early days of COVID. Luckily, that's all behind us now, and we're going to be talking about something much more positive. He has a new book out titled The Show Goes On: Broadway Hirings, Firings, and Replacements. Please welcome Ron Fassler.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Drum roll, applause, entrance music.
To start things off, would you mind telling us about the book?
Sure. I write a column that's online called Theater Yesterday and Today. And I wrote a column a couple of years ago about replacements. And it was so popular, I wrote a second, then I wrote a third. And after the third column, I realized I still had so many more stories to tell because the actors that go into shows, either as replacements in a long running Broadway show or on the road when someone's fired and they've got to rush in at the last minute and take over, or understudies and standbys who go on, swings, those dancers that have to learn 10 different tracks in a show. I don't know how they do it. I find these stories heroic, and there are so many to trove through. It kind of surprised me that no one had ever created a book out of it. So after those three columns, I went, you know what? I'm going to write a book. And I interviewed 100 people currently involved in theater all over the country. And I took 2.5 years from the day I decided to write the book to when it was published. And it's over 400 pages. And I couldn't be happier with how it turned out. People are really enjoying the stories. My favorite compliment came from someone just this week. A friend texted me and said, Ron, your book is like candy. So you can't get much better than that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm someone who really tried to read one chapter a day, although one day where had off from work, so I end up reading the final two, and yeah, I really devoured it.
That's it. I love when people say they devoured it, or people who say they're doling it out to themselves in small parcels because they don't want it to end. Again, you just can't do better than that in terms of getting compliments. Anybody who loves theater or has a theater library should have this book. I know I'm saying that because I want to sell some books, but it's one you might want to take off the shelf from time to time and just pick up and read. I certainly was hoping that I would enter the same sphere as such really terrific theater books as William Goldman's The Season or Ken Mandelbaum's Not Since Carrie. I mean, those books you can just pick up at any time and just read again and again and again. And I hope this will be one of those books.
Oh, yes. In fact, some of the casting stories you wrote about, I was already aware of, although reading about them here in greater detail gave me a whole new perspective.
Right. I mean, I really loved researching. In fact, an old friend who's known me like 40 years, he said, Ron, I'm reading the book and I just have to stop on occasion and just go, how does Ron know all this stuff? And that makes me laugh. But he also said, of course, you researched it, but it doesn't read like research. It reads like I've just bumped into somebody at a cocktail party and they've got the greatest stories and I just don't want them to stop telling them. And again, these are my favorite compliments to receive because that's exactly how I want the book to read. I'm very passionate about theater. I always have been since I was a little boy. And I just want to convey that passion in my writing. I love telling stories and I just want to keep on telling stories until I was going to say until I run out of them. I'll never run out of them, but I just want to do it for the rest of my life. I find that this, after years of being an actor and a writer, a screenwriter, playwright, all these things I did in my life, this is what I really feel like I was put on this earth for, is to just collect theater stories and tell them and put them into entertaining books. And my chapters, as you know, because you read the book, are all very specific. And I hope you enjoyed that they're all titled either as song lyrics or titles of Broadway show songs.
Oh,
There's a lot of Easter eggs in the book, a lot of little fun little things between the lines if you get some inside jokes that I throw in from time to time.
oh, absolutely. And that leads into my next question, which is how did you go about doing research for the book?
Well, certain stories I knew would have to be in the book, right? I mean, if you're going to have a chapter on understudies going on, there you have to tell the Shirley MacLaine story of when she went on in the pajama game back in the 1950s. I mean, because that's the story that almost seems like it was written for a movie. Shirley MacLaine was just a young chorus girl. She was only 21 years old. She goes on for Carol Haney, who had two show-stopping numbers in the Pajama Game. She had no rehearsal. She did not have a single rehearsal. And then she ended up going on a few more times. And within that first month of the run, she went on. And one of the biggest producers in all of Hollywood, Hal Wallace, the man produced Casablanca, for God's sakes. And he saw her and just said, I'm going to make you a star. And the next thing she knew, Alfred Hitchcock had come to see the show. Both of them, Hitchcock and Wallace, they were there to see Carol Haney. They were there to see the woman who created the part. They got this understudy instead, who, as we all know, was just destined to be a star. I mean, there's only one Shirley MacLaine. I mean, she was going to make it some other way, but she made it in a way that you would swear it was scripted as a movie. Because within a year of the opening night of Pajama Game, she was starring in Alfred Hitchcock's The Trouble with Harry. And that was it. Her career was set. I mean, within 5 years, I think she was nominated for 4 Academy Awards. It's insane. That story had to be there. But then I wanted to sort of, find others. And that's where interviews with over 100 people helped. And I love discovering ones that I'd never heard before. And that's when I also know I've done good, when someone who's a real theater historian like myself will go, Ron, didn't know that one. Hadn't heard that one. And yes, the research was extraordinary. And I barely left my apartment, to be honest with you. I mean, I've got all these books behind me that you see. The internet is incredible. Like if I wanted to talk about Richard Burton when he took over in Equus, do you know how many Richard Burton biographies there are?
I
There's
bet a
at least
lot.
50, like 15 of them. And you can actually go online and find the books and read them without having to go to a library. Some I did have to sort of purchase to find out, but I would go to every one of those Richard Burton books, go to the index, see if they talked about Equus, and then boom, I've got some stories, I've got some perspectives, I've got some interviews. But yeah, I love research because I always quote my friend Winnie Holtzman, the book writer of Wicked, who said to me, "Oh, I love research too because it's not writing." And if you're a writer and you have to face a blank page, you know how great that statement is and how true that is.
Yeah, and of all the research you did, were there any interesting facts that surprised you most?
Oh, sure. I mean, the thing is, I love to dig deep. Like when I was writing my first book and I going to devote a chapter to James Earl Jones and his career, I was reading up on him and I read about this one night in his life when he and his father, who he'd been basically estranged from his whole life, finally had a weekend together in New York City. And Jones was a very young man in his early 20s. And in the book, it said, and Dad and I went to see 3 Broadway shows. And I'm like, what were the shows? Like, I can't believe the person didn't follow up. So I was determined when I spoke to James Earl Jones that I was going to find out what those 3 shows were. And that's the kind of research I love to do. I just want to get into every little nook and cranny and also give a sense of a context. What was going on Broadway at the time that this person was doing that and this person was doing that, because otherwise it's just, and then they did that, and then they did this, and then they did that. And that's boring. So I really do love finding the little tiny things that set the story off. So yes, I have gotten compliments about, oh, I've heard that story for years, but I didn't realize that. And that's right. I just adore the research. And one other thing too is that, you can also go online and read old newspapers. They are invaluable, especially Broadway, because in the old days, there were like 15 newspapers in New York in like the 30s, 40s, 50s. And every one of them had their own theater columnist, like a gossip columnist. And they were all hungry for tidbits. So there's always these little great, was talking to, Rex Harrison the other night, and he told me, and then it's great. I mean, and those things aren't out there because they were just one night only little items in newspapers. So if you can track them down, boy, they're gold.
And how did you go about structuring the book?
Well, it sort of wrote itself, to be honest with you. I knew that I would have to have a chapter on understudies, which, because I used lyrics, I used, "Are there stars out tonight? Are there stars out tonight? Are there stars out tonight?" Yes, they are. There's understudy. I have a chapter called Beautiful Girls, which is about the great leading ladies who conquered in Hello Dolly, Mame, those big lady shows, as theater historian Ethan Morden calls them. One was called Just a Little Touch of Star Quality, the song from Evita. And that's just about what is a star, what constitutes a star. So yeah, they all just sort of kept going. And when I had a bunch of stories I couldn't fit into these chapters, that became the final chapter. Have an egg roll, Mr. Goldstone, because it's just like, what goes into Chinese food, this, that, and the other thing. So I just threw those stories on and created one last chapter, sort of a potpourri, as they say on Jeopardy.
Well, yeah, which I remember seeing that your son got to be on Jeopardy once.
Yes, my son was a Jeopardy contestant, and even though it was pre-taped and I knew that he lost, he was leading the entire game going into Final Jeopardy. So I'm sitting on the edge of my seat at home watching, knowing he lost, but still like, come on, Jeremy. But he missed the Final Jeopardy question. He had the most money going in. He was leading at the first commercial break, the second commercial break, and going into Final Jeopardy. So kind of painful. And don't ask me to repeat the question because I've forgotten it. I don't even want to know the thing
Okay.
that cost my son the championship.
Well, I haven't seen that episode, but anyway.
Yeah, yeah,
And as a member of the American Theater Critics Association, I got to attend their 2019 conference in New York, and one of the panels during it was with leaders of the cast recording industry, such as Van Dien, Kurt Deutsch, and Scott Farthing. And I remember they talked about how rare it is for replacements in Broadway productions to get their own cast albums, in parts because they're barely profitable. I mean, notable exceptions are Hello Dolly when Pearl Bailey did a stint as the title character in the original production, and Kiss of the Spider Woman when Vanessa Williams took over for Chita Rivera as Aurora. Not to mention that Nick Jonas did an EP of songs from How to Succeed in Business without really trying during his run
right.
in the most recent revival, as did Laura Benanti when she took over for Lauren Ambrose as Eliza Doolittle in My Fair Lady.
That's right. Yeah, yeah. Cast replacements don't really get their own album. It's very rare. And I was quite interested in what went down during the famous fracas over Funny Girl from 3 years ago because I turned that into my very first chapter in the book because that story is still in the zeitgeist. People remember that big switch from Beanie Feldstein to Leah Michelle and how they turned a show that had opened to pretty mixed reviews and was really heading south at the box office and it looked like it was going to close early. And they took that wild leap, fired Beanie Feldstein, brought Leah Michelle in, and it became a sellout and it turned its fortunes completely around. And by the time it closed over a year later, it had earned all of its $16 million back. And when it came time to do the cast recording, they didn't have an interest in Beanie on the recording. And Leah Michelle, of course, did it. It's not called the original Broadway cast recording, it's called the new Broadway cast recording. That was another rarity. But yes, I spend almost 25 pages telling that story and also a lot of history about Funny Girl and how Barbara Streisand got the part and how that show was put together. And I thought that was a great way to lead people into the book. I mean, if I started the book with a story about Ethel Merman or Mary Martin, they've been dead a long time. I wanted to capture something that's going on now. And hopefully people would read it and say, oh, I can't wait for chapter 2. Oh, now one more before I go to bed, chapter 3, right? Hook them. So if you have any interest in the Funny Girl story, that's chapter 1. It's a great Broadway replacement story. There's really almost no other one like it.
Oh yeah, real juicy one.
I mean, I'm just, as a former actor, or as I like to say, I'm a recovering actor. I'm fascinated by the process with which an actor has to make a role their own. I mean, just imagine, trying to follow Carol Channing in Hello Dolly. I mean, and they gave it to Ginger Rogers, who was, one of the greatest movie musical stars of the 1930s and 40s. She'd done Broadway, obviously. She started out on Broadway, and she'd gone back to Broadway during that time, but she went into Dolly, and the box office did not suffer. She did it for 2 years, and then, of course, David Merrick, the most sensational producer, really, of the 20th century on Broadway. Wow, what he did! I mean, how he was able to constantly refresh Dolly so that it could run for 7 years with 7 different stars, culminating in the final performances being done by Ethel Merman, who the part had been written for originally. And she didn't have an interest in playing it. She was tired. She'd just come off of Gypsy for 3 years, 2 on Broadway and 1 on the road. But boy, 7 years later, she was getting tired of being, sitting around the house. She wanted to get back into action, and the show closed with Ethel Merman in what was her last Broadway appearance. I got to see it too as a 13-year-old. That's the other thing too. I've been going to the theater for 55 years, so I have seen a lot of these shows that I'm writing about. So a lot of what I report on is firsthand reporting, and it's not dispassionate. I mean, I'm not just going to say, that I saw Ethel Merman and Dolly. No, I'm going to tell you what I thought of her. I'm going to tell you how she fit in, how it worked. So, of course, I'm a theater critic, but also I cannot write dispassionately about Broadway. I don't know how to do that. It can only be passionate. So that's what I hope spills out over on the pages. I don't know about you or some of your listeners, but you read a certain book about, let's say you got a biography of a great actor, and if that author doesn't really give their own personal take on things, then it's like I said before. Then they did this, then they did that, then they did this. It's not exciting.
Oh, yeah, and to add what you mentioned about Ginger Rogers and Hello Dolly, when I was reading in the book about how her performing Before the Parade Passes By in Ed Sullivan, immediately looked it up on YouTube and shared it with my mom because, fun fact, what her grandmother did for a living, what my mom's grandmother did for a living, she was a seamstress for several celebrities, one of which was Ginger Rogers.
Wow, that's a full circle moment.
Well, yeah,
Yes, that
my
is one thing I do in the book. I will say, go look at Reba McEntire in certain scenes from Annie Get Your Gun if you want to see how a replacement makes apart their own. I really do instruct people. In fact, a friend of mine said it took me so much longer to read your book because I kept going to YouTube to look at some of the clips you you were suggesting.
yeah, my mom even still has a pair of autographed pictures of Ginger Rogers at her home.
That's nice. That's nice.
Yeah,
A little bit of
yeah.
a little touch of immortality. Yeah.
Yeah, so out of curiosity, are there any acclaimed Broadway replacements from yesteryear that you would have loved to have had preserved on CD?
Oh yeah, sure. That's a great question. I mean, well, certainly the Reba McEntire Annie Get Your Gun. I mean, they were almost going to make a television special out of it. There was interest from CBS, which is really too bad because the one Ethel Merman did in 1966 when she revived it on Broadway, and she was getting on in years. She had created the role in the 1940s. She came back to Broadway in the 60s and did it again. They nicknamed it Granny, Get Your Gun. And they did film it for television, and it aired on NBC on a Sunday night. I remember watching it, and apparently the tapes were destroyed. People thinking, well, who needs these tapes, right? Not realizing there would be a market later on in the beta VHS DVD streaming universe. And that's kind of a holy grail among collectors that maybe somebody has a copy of that sitting in a closet somewhere and it'll get discovered one day. But I don't think so. It's been a long time, over 60 years, and no one's found it yet.
If Reba McEntire did her stint in Annie Get Your Gun on Broadway 10 years later, it probably would have been perfect fit right in with, the era of the 2010s where we're getting these live TV musicals.
Absolutely. Or even when Glenn Close came back and did Sunset Boulevard when she was 70 years old. I mean, Reba could come back in her well, she's probably hitting it now, 60s, and do it because she's just got that incredible youthful quality. And boy, when you do look at those YouTube clips, I mean, Bernadette Peters won the Tony for playing Annie in that season, but most people all agree that the role really belonged to her replacement. And that is a very rare thing on Broadway. Or what Pearl Bailey did when she came into Hello Dolly. I mean, she just reinvented the part. And in ways that Ginger Rogers, Martha Raye, Betty Grable couldn't, because of course she was bringing her whole, the center of her soul, her blackness to the production, which was an all black production, which was also incredibly ahead of its time in terms of bringing in an entire new company, not just the star. David Merrick decided to send the show on the road with an all black company. And it was so successful. He went, you know what? This is gold. If I bring her to Broadway, I could make Dolly a sellout again. And that's what he did. In the fourth year of that show on Broadway, 4 years is a long time. And man, it was incredible. He launched and it became a sellout hit all over again. And of course, producers nowadays are not that hip on replacements. For instance, Hugh Jackman did The Music Man a couple of years ago. He sold out that show every single week. I mean, it was grossing 3 million a week. I mean, it was doing great. Did they have discussions about replacing him? Yeah, kind of like maybe we could get Justin Timberlake, maybe we could get, and they just decided, you know what, we've made back our money. Let's just quit while we're ahead. The risk of bringing in somebody new has to be re-advertised, which costs money. You have to suffer the drop in the box office and kind of explain that to people. It's risky. So instead of the risk, they just close it. Puts 100 people out of work. It's sad. The old days, a producer would have just kept on trying.
Yeah, especially, in this post-COVID world, things producing on Broadway has become more expensive than it already has.
course, of course. I mean, I remember when Red, the play by John Logan that had starred Alfred Molina and Eddie Redmayne, was on Broadway. Well, it was only for a limited engagement because both of them had film commitments. It won the Tony, and do you know that it closed 2 weeks after the Tony Awards because they they'd made their money back. And to then say, okay, you want to see the Tony Award winning best play? Here's our two new actors, so and so and so and so. And they decided not worth the risk and they closed it. And that's a damn shame. It's a terrific play. Those parts are amazing parts. They could have found two fantastic actors, but they closed it. There is a
Well,
rumor right now, not even a rumor. They say they're going to do it, but I'm not sure they will. But this current Glengarry Glen Ross that is going to open on Broadway next week, starring Kieran Culkin and Bob Odenkirk and Bob Burr, they're only contracted through, I think, early or maybe late June or July because of so many of them have other commitments, films, etc. They're going to bring in another company and use all women. I've nicknamed that production Glengarry Glenn Close. I mean, I'm not the first person to do that, but who knows if they're going to do it? I mean, it sounds like a great idea. I mean, the sets are there. Why close it? Just bring in a female cast and see if we can run it a bit longer. But let's see what happens. Let's see if the production gets great reviews. Let's see how it goes. But I know they're sitting around putting that cast together right now. And if they can manage to do it with enough big names, we'll see that all-female Glengarry Glen Ross sometime during the summer.
yes, and in the book, you went into great detail about how Joe Papp really championed colorblind casting during his tenure at the Public Theater, and I actually spoke with his widow, Gail Merrifield Papp, almost 2 years ago about her memoir, and she touched upon that during our conversation. And nowadays, we're seeing colorblind casting more often in stories that aren't race-specific. What are your thoughts on how far we've come since the days Joe Papp was revolutionizing that?
Absolutely. I really do go into that because I think it was quite important. I actually cite all those early castings that were courageous. When Richard Rodgers wrote his first musical without Oscar Hammerstein, No Strings, he wrote it for Diane Carroll. He had seen Diane Carroll perform on a musical variety program, and he contacted her the next day and took her to lunch and said, I'm thinking about writing a new musical. Would you like to star in it? And of course, she said yes. And she ended up winning the Tony Award. And this is the funny part, though. She was Black, and her co-star Richard Colley was white. And it was a love story, but they didn't want to call attention to it at all. It's never mentioned in the script, and it even has a disclaimer in the printed copy, which I found in the published version of No Strings. It actually says, we are not mentioning it. Please do not mention it. Don't make anything of it, which is kind of like hiding it under the rug, in a certain sense, because it was a bold thing to do. It's great that she got the chance. I mean, nobody was breaking down Diane Carroll's door, even though she had starred in House of Flowers and had done Porgy and Bess in the film and done some really great work. People weren't writing for Black actors like that. And so it was great that someone as distinguished and with the reputation of a Richard Rodgers wanted to do that. But Joe Papp, he gave Raul Julia, a Spanish-speaking, guy who would just not drop the accent. He would keep it for all those roles he played in Shakespeare. And that was courageous. And yes, we've come a very, very long way towards that now. And it's a very interesting subject. And I made sure with that chapter and only that chapter to send it to certain individuals who are Asian or Spanish speaking or Black or, I just wanted to make sure, me, white guy, I got it right. And I was very happy when they all said, no, spot on, Ron, this is great. And I really enjoyed the interviews I did with certain actors about their experience in this world of being denied a part because basically, they're not the right color, and that's wrong. And there's been so many steps to amend the situation that I think we can all be proud of right now.
Yes, and plus, one could never do race-specific stories with different races playing characters that are supposed to be completely different ethnicities in this day and age. I mean, there'd be huge protests from people if there was something like an all-whites production of Dreamgirls.
Of course, I like to say my son did an all-white production of The Wiz when he was in high school. It was, I mean, it's sad. I shouldn't have done it, but they did it. But yeah, I mean, I think it's fantastic. I've seen just so many new and exciting actors who would not have gotten these opportunities a few years ago, even.
And on a side note, it was ironic for me to read about how back in the day, Elmore James, an African American actor, auditioned for The Beast in the first national tour of Beauty and the Beast, but was turned down because Disney didn't want to make this statement that all black men are beasts. And this summer, Disney will be launching a brand new national tour of Beauty and the Beast, and it's going to have an African American playing the Beast, which will be Hamilton alum Fergie L. Philippi.
Well, listen, Elmore James's response when they told him that they didn't want the black, beast, he went, "Oh, so a black man can't be a prince, right?" I mean, isn't that what you're saying too? It's incredible the ignorance that follows with that kind of thing. It really is.
And of course, as mentioned, you also went into great detail about examples of understudies who went on to become stars, which is, as something that Seth Rudetsky keeps saying on SiriusXM on Broadway, never be disappointed you're seeing an understudy because you'll never know. That understudy could someday go on to become a star. Examples I've heard him mention are BB North going on for Debbie Allen in Sweet Charity, Victoria Clark going on for Faith Prince in Guys and Dolls, and Billy Porter going on in Smokey Joe's Cafe.
Yes, in fact, I have a little story that Bibi Newirth tells when she was going on for Debbie Allen in that revival of Sweet Charity back in '86, and she would hear that groan at tonight's performance. The role usually played by Debbie Allen, we played by Bibi Newirth, and the whole audience goes, and instead of being deflated by it, she was like, "Oh yeah, huh? Really? I'll show you." Pow! And she would come out with all that energy that she's capable of. And I'm sure she was fantastic. Yes, absolutely. I even quote my own mother, who went to see One Touch of Venus when she was a teenager on Broadway, which starred Mary Martin. And when they made that announcement, the role today will be played by so and so and not Mary Martin, she watched as half the audience got up and left. And my mother was like in the last row. So what did she do? My mother, practical as she always was, moved down to like the front row, the front mezzanine, and settled in. And she said to her dying day, "I can't imagine Mary Martin was any better than that lovely woman who I saw play that part."
And in the chapter, Everyone Deserves the Chance to Fly, you mentioned several examples of actors who successfully took over for the original stars in Broadway shows, and the productions went on to do just fine. And reading about them, I felt was a great reminder of how, when audiences attend a show sometime after the original principals leave, seeing them is not a necessity because whoever the current cast is, they can still do such great work in their own right.
Exactly. I started going to the theater as a teenager. From the time of 12 years old onward, I was going to the theater every week. You ask, how could I afford that? Well, it was 50 years ago. To sit in the last row of a Broadway house was $3. So it was really affordable to everybody. My first book, in fact, is called Up in the Cheap Seats. And that's where I sat, and I couldn't have been happier. And I saw over 200 Broadway shows in the first 4 years I started going to the theater. Between the ages of 12 and 16, I saw 200 shows. And you may ask, how do I know it was 200? Well, behind me on this shelf are my loose leaf binders of the reviews I wrote for every show. Play number 12, play number 120. I've got them all. I know exactly where I sat because I wrote it all down and what I paid for each ticket. And it was really amazing that I could have this opportunity that is not affordable to young kids today to be able to see all this theater and make up my own mind, make up my own opinions. I saw a lot of shows in previews and I'd wait for opening night and see if the critics agreed with me. There was a couple of shows that I decided, oh, I want to go see that replacement because so-and-so just took over at a show. And I remember there was a show called Lenny about Lenny Bruce. It was played by Cliff Gorman, wonderful actor. He won the Tony, and I was gobsmacked by his performance. Everybody was. Well, he was replaced by a guy named Sandy Barron, who I knew as a stand-up comedian, even though he was an actor. I used to see him on, The Tonight Show. And I thought, I wonder what a real stand-up comedian as opposed to an actor would do with the role of Lenny Bruce. So I went back to see it again. I paid to see it one more time, which is rare. I really just sort of saved those $3 for original shows and not seeing repeat performances. But I couldn't believe how good Sandy Barron was. And honestly, I thought to myself, wow, I just saw somebody do something I didn't think was possible. I mean, be just as good as that person I thought was irreplaceable. And then I realized, wow, actors can absolutely do the impossible. And that's part of my huge tribute that I pay in this book to the heroism that some of these actors perform. I mean, the Liza Minnelli stories of when she went into Chicago on a minute's notice because Gwen Verdon couldn't do the show and it was actually going to close because they weren't doing great business. But when Liza came in, it seemed like the show was a hit because you couldn't get a ticket. So as soon as Gwen Verdon came back, it was a hot show. Liza did an incredible, favor to her good buddies Candor and Ebb and Bob Fosse. She also did it again when Julie Andrews got sick during Victor Victoria. And that show was threatening to close because without Julie Andrews, there was no show. And Liza, they asked her, can you please? I mean, it was a personal plea from Blake Edwards and Julie Andrews, can you save our show, Liza? And she went in and did it for like 5 weeks, to cover the gap until Julie was back. And I just love telling those kinds of stories. I think it's just amazing what actors will do for other actors. It was selfless in terms of Liza, because you could have fallen on her face, such a short rehearsal period and all that. To be compared to Gwen Verdon, to be compared to Julie Andrews. Again, that's one of the things that really, really made the book an eye-opening experience for me, was so many books of heroism, so many stories of heroism that took me by surprise. And hopefully the reader too.
Obviously, there are countless other stories regarding this topic that weren't included in the book. One of them, Tony Sheldon posted in the Broadway by Broadway Facebook group about how there were several players from Amelie who sadly fell by the wayside throughout the process, including Samantha Barks, who played the title character in the world premiere production, but Philip Basu replaced her for the Broadway run. Were there any Broadway casting stories you wanted to include but couldn't?
Oh yeah. There were a bunch of stories that were in the book, but when I hit 400 pages, I went, "That's it. I can't have a 430-page book or more." And in the, the tradition of nothing goes to waste, I turned all those stories into columns. So if you go to my website, ronfassler.org, you can see some great stories I've posted over the last few months. I tell the story about when Little Shop of Horrors was going to have its first Broadway production years after the original off-Broadway one had closed, and they were in Florida, that they fired the director, brought in Jerry Zaks as the new director, who fired everybody in the cast except for Hunter Foster, who was playing Seymour, and brought in an entirely new cast. It's common, people sometimes are out of town and something's just not working. The story of Lainey Kazan being replaced in Seesaw by Michelle Lee, I always knew I was going to have to tell that story, because when they brought Michael Bennett in to save that show out of town, he fired 13 people in the show. I mean, it was a bloodbath, but he turned the show around. It's incredible what goes into these shows when so much is riding on the line, millions and millions of dollars, or in those days, a million or two, but the same amount of money, because we're talking relative in terms of costs. $1 million was a lot of money in 1970.
Yeah, while others that weren't included in the book that I thought of were, Joanna Pasidi getting fired from the first revival of Annie before it arrived on
Yes.
Broadway, the
Mhm.
casting changes of Finding Neverland from Boston to New York, and Stephanie J. Block, how she was replaced by Idina Menzel by the time Wicked premiered, the latter of which Carol DeGiry did go into in her book, Defying Gravity.
Yes. In fact, I was an eyewitness to Stephanie Block being in Wicked because of my relationship with Winnie Holtzman. I was invited to take part in the very first reading of Wicked, where we sat around a table and we read out loud and sang the songs of Act One. And when I tell you that that reading went on for 2 hours, it was a 2 hour Act One. And Stephanie Block was Elphaba, and she was phenomenal. And then the next time we did a much bigger version of it, obviously the whole show at that point, and that's when Kristen Chenoweth came in. And then I got to watch the chemistry between Kristen and Stephanie, which was remarkable. We did another one, and that is when they brought in Adina, because that's when Joe Mantello came aboard as director, and he just had it in his head that Adina Menzel would be the perfect Elphaba. And she struggled a little bit. I also attended the out of town tryout in San Francisco because of my connection to it and my love for the piece and wanting to see when he had a hit. And she was struggling. Stephanie was still in the show at that point, by the way. She was the understudy and she was in the chorus. And when I went backstage to see Stephanie, she actually said to me, "Well, I'm not going to Broadway with it." And I went, "Oh, wow, why not?" And she said, "I'm going to be in The Boy from Oz playing Liza Minnelli with Hugh Jackman." So everything worked out for her. And then, of course, she starred in the national tour and did eventually play it on Broadway. So Stephanie did get to do Elphaba, and she was the very first Elphaba. Yeah. But then again, Adina won the Tony, so Joe Mantello might have been just correct in his supposition that she was the perfect Elphaba.
Well, yeah, and I actually got to see Stephanie in concert in my area back in December, and she talked about the whole story of how she was involved with the workshops, and she mentioned how, Act One was nearing 3 hours long, and the creative team needed to trim it down considerably, which was I thought
Yes,
was ironic because the movie that was recently released was about as long as the stage musical, and it only covered the first act. Although Stephanie did mention
exactly.
that
They
she was
went back to
happy
that.
to, yeah, but Stephanie did mention she was happy to see some of the cut material restored in the film.
Absolutely. Yeah, I still sing some of the songs that I can recall that were cut. But yeah, she's exaggerating a little bit. That first read through was 2 hours, not 3 hours. But that's long for a first act, and that's a whole musical. And yes, ironic that the new version is over 2 hours and is only still half the musical. Yeah. It's a risk that truly paid off. What if this part one wasn't good? Well, what were they going to do with part two? Now people are going to be clamoring. And the first part made $1 billion. So yeah, part two is going to be a very big hit, and we're going to see them back at the Oscars. I can tell you that right now.
And a couple years ago, you did a whole piece on your blog inspired by the George Pal Time Machine film, where you explored past stage productions you would love to see if you could travel through time. Now I'm going to ask you
Sure,
this. If you could go
sure.
back in time just to be a fly on the wall for any of the casting stories you wrote about, which would you choose?
Oh, you mean like be in the room for the casting session, like when they said, that's our Hitler, like from the producers, or meaning just to have been to see some of the great performances I was too young to see. Is that what you mean?
Well, I mean, I guess to see what was going on behind the scenes involving the
Right.
casting.
Yeah, literally the fly on the wall. Well, I mean, the one that's been chronicled so well was what happened with My Fair Lady, because that musical did not come together in its first performance. There have been exaggerations of how long it ran on its first night in New Haven. Uh, and it was definitely over 3 hours. Some say four, but it wasn't. But it was definitely over 3 hours. And the next day, famously so, Moss Hart, the director, sat the company down and said, "We're going to make some cuts, and I don't want to hear a word. Rex, come to the ball is cut. I don't want to hear a word. Julie, say a prayer for me tonight is cut. I don't want to hear a word. The so and so ballet cut ensemble. I don't want to hear a word." And the other funny thing was that Julie Andrews was not quite landing. And there's a famous story that Moss Hart dismissed the entire company. And for one weekend, a Saturday and a Sunday, he was alone with Julie Andrews on the stage of the Mark Hellinger Theater. And line by line, piece by piece, bit by bit, he spoon fed her Eliza Doolittle. And theater historian Miles Kruger claims to have been in the house, and he actually watched that happen. So that's the great fly on the wall story, to have actually seen a performance come together like that. Now a legendary performance. Yeah, those are the theater stories you just, or to, have been out of town with a show like Guys and Dolls or any one of these great, great musicals, to have seen them develop and come together. It just must have been extraordinary, because there really aren't big out of town runs anymore. Sometimes they'll do a production at a regional theater and then they'll go. But the old days of going to Boston and Philadelphia and maybe another stop in Detroit and then bringing it to town, it's just too expensive. And also with
Well,
sets being what they are, people expect these shows to be spectacles. You can't tour with those sets. I mean, Sweeney Todd had to preview in New York because it had no other choice. That set literally weighed tons. It was an old iron foundry that they brought piece by piece onto the stage at the Gershwin and cobbled together. When it toured, the set never looked like that. And that was risky because I was living in New York at that time. I was a 21-year-old, starting my career, and Sweeney Todd was not supposed to be that good. In previews, they were questioning whether this was going to have a run or not. And then won 8 Tony Awards, and now it's a classic.
well, yeah, and when shows open cold in New York nowadays, well, sometimes they're successful, like Book of Mormon, although other times, well, they clearly would benefit from having an out-of-town tryouts, like Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown.
Yeah, and that got re-cobbled together. Bart Sher, the director, stayed with it when they did it in London and made all the corrections he sort of fought for and didn't get. And apparently that's the production that's licensed now. That's the one that will probably come back to New York at some point, and we'll see it because I hear it's much improved. They did that with a number of shows. Shrek was also improved after it opened on Broadway. They took to heart some of those reviews. There are actually cases where Broadway shows opened and the producer director went in and tinkered with the show. Pajama Game was tinkered with after it opened. Camelot was tinkered with after it opened, and really helped create them into the hits that they were.
Oh yeah, not to mention there was also a story of how Frank Galati was the original director of Seussical, but was fired while he was out of town in Boston, while Rob Marshall came in to try to fix it up for Broadway. That still wasn't successful, but Lynn Ahrens and Stephen Flaherty went back after Broadway and retooled it and became much more successful.
Oh, it's one of the most successful shows there is in terms of community theater and high schools and colleges. Yeah, yeah, they turned it around. Well, sometimes you run out of time. It's just, you have to open. You can't stay in previews forever. It's costly, and then it adds on to the fact that your show isn't doing so great or is in trouble, and that also taints the critics. I mean, I'm a critic. I try to go and see everything with very, very open-minded. Please, please, I want this to be a hit. Not you better be good. That's so counterproductive. But it's hard not to get that little voice in your head. The show's in trouble. The show's, oh my God, they had to fire so and so. But sometimes they do all that and make it better. You have to remember. I'm actually considering my next book being about the shows that were disasters out of town, and then by the time they came to New York, they were hits. They turned it around. They're great stories. Again, I love stories of uplift, and although it's fun to tell the stories of the disasters are sometimes very entertaining, but they all end badly. They all end sadly. So it'd be nice to maybe balance the book with stories like that with all of the stories of triumph.
Oh yeah, yeah. Like I remember reading how Andrew Lip mentioned how when he made all the revisions to the score for the Addams Family went out on tour and licensing, he said he wished he had made them for Broadway early on, but there wasn't enough time between out of town and New York.
Exactly. They had to fire the director out of town. Jerry Zaks came in on that one. Jerry Zaks came in on Smokey Joe's Cafe, turned that into a hit, turned Addams Family into a hit. He became a very famous play doctor, is what they used to call them. George Abbott, who was responsible for so many of the biggest successes of the 30s and 40s, 50s, right up into Forum in the 60s, had one of the longest careers of any working director. He was known as the ultimate play doctor. And my favorite story about that is one day he was in the back of the theater with the creators of whatever show it was, and it wasn't going so well. And he turned to them and he said, "Well, I think we better call George Abbott."
Yeah, lots of stories. So Ron, I thank you very much for devoting your time to this conversation. It was great getting to talk to you.
Oh, always a pleasure. And just remember, if you want to see or read The Show Goes On, here's my big commercial for it. Just go to my website, ronfassler.org. It's not available on Amazon. It's exclusively through me, and it's going great. People are loving it. Makes a great gift. And if you love theater, I think you'll really enjoy the book. And if you forget, it's ronfassler.org. Just Google Ron Fassler. Just Google The Show Goes On. It'll take you there.
All right. And for those who'd like to keep up with your career, where can people find you on the internet?
Yeah, ronfassler.org. It's all there. My columns, Theater Yesterday and Today, how to buy my book, and any theater gossip I can possibly hand over. It's mine to share, yours to have.
All right. So thanks again for joining me today, Ron. This was great.
A pleasure as always, Jeffrey. Thanks so much.